Hello and welcome to this episode of the Pensions Perspectives podcast brought to you by WTW. I'm your host, Luna Fadayel, a scheme actuary and relationship manager. Now, the DB pensions landscape has changed dramatically over the last few years. High gilt yields have made deficits a thing of the past for many schemes. Indeed, the annual funding statement that the regulator published last year showed that over 75% of schemes are now fully funded on a low dependency basis. As such, the focus in the boardroom has shifted from negotiations around deficit contributions to endgame strategies and discussions around surplus opportunities. Now, joining me today to talk through this further are Bina, Mistry and Adam Boys. Welcome both.
Yeah.
So to start us off, can you let our listeners know what it is that you do?
Okay, I'll go first. I'm Bina Mistry. I advise sponsors and trustees and company joint working groups on a wide range of pension issues, pretty much any pension issue, on a wide variety of scheme sizes. I'm also head of corporate consulting at WTW and therefore sit on our UK leadership team with a wide range of responsibilities, covering all angles of how we consult with our clients and dealing with the evolving pensions landscape that we have.
And well, in some ways, I'm Bina's counterpart on the UK leadership team. So looking after a lot of the same things, but with my role as head of trustee consulting, much more of a trustee mindset. We're not adversaries, we do agree on quite a lot. So there's a lot of collaboration there. And then with the rest of my day job, I'm a scheme actuary to several large defined benefit schemes.
Well, I'm glad I don't need to sit in your seat to split you two up. So let's try and keep it civil.
We don't know. Let's see how the conversation goes.
Now, for most of my career, we have been dealing with funding deficits. So what's changed in the landscape?
Well, I think, you sort of look back, great financial crisis and beyond, it was a very polarized landscape. It was really the haves and the have-nots. The have hedged and the have not hedged. And we saw, some schemes that were sort of dealing with, gilt yields as they sort of just went down and down and down, and others that were struggling. And so it was, very difficult valuations through that period. As we sort of look the other side of COVID, the geopolitical stuff that happened afterwards, we had the spike in inflation, and from 2022 onwards, gilt yields rising. That really has changed the sort of circumstances of schemes across the whole picture. So as you said in your introduction, 75% funded on a low dependency basis, something like around half fully funded on a buyout basis. And, obviously there's still schemes that have some funding challenges ahead, but for the majority, they're in just a vastly different place. And I think the thing in the landscape that's really changed is that there's much more open-mindedness and thinking about strategy. I think when solvency was so far away, it just felt like a dream. It kind of an irrelevance and an annoyance sometimes to have to disclose such a sort of a poor funding level on that kind of basis. But now it's, within touching distance, or schemes have got the capital to be able to transact. There's actually much more open-mindedness in terms of, well, is it the right thing to do straight away? Or is there a different vision for the scheme that, delivers more value for the stakeholders?
There is a shift in mindset for sponsors as well. They have been hurt in the past. But, having piled millions, tens of millions of deficit contributions into pension schemes, we talk about the 75%. I think that represents 160 billion of surpluses on a low dependency basis. Looking at the PPF Purple Book, about 200 billion has been paid in DRCs over the last 20 years since the new funding regime back in 2005, and about 50 billion of that in the last 4 years. So, it's right that sponsors also pause and think, what is the right endgame strategy for us? What should we be doing in our pension schemes? And is there an opportunity to get some of this money back? Today's discussion here. And I think the changing regulations, as well as a real change in what we're hearing and seeing from the pensions regulator, both in striving for innovation, supporting growth, supporting running of schemes, keeping schemes open, is all part and parcel of that shift in landscape.
Yeah, and actually on that particular point, so before the famous Mansion House speech, we'd published a white paper outlining 6 proposed changes to help seize the surplus opportunity. Could you remind our listeners what actual changes have been proposed in the last year or so and the expected timescales for that?
Yeah, so 3 main changes, which are currently in the draft pensions bill. The first is a statutory resolution for trustees to override any existing restrictions in scheme rules to allow surplus to be paid on an ongoing basis. And that should be quite wide-ranging, as we understand, to cover all current restrictions in the rules. Secondly, the threshold for which surpluses can be distributed is being lowered from the current buyout level to the low dependency level. That is just a minimum, but it does open up the size of the surplus that you're being considered here. And then thirdly, there is an additional requirement currently for surpluses to be released to be in the interests of members. That wording is being deleted and says it just falls back to normal fiduciary duties of trustees, which, by its very definition means you consider relevant factors. Those relevant factors do include the employer's interest as well. So it makes the whole discussion a lot more, enables surplus release more possible.
And there was a further announcement in the budget, wasn't there, about refunding or being able to pay lump sums to members. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so that is happening from April 2027. I should say the other changes we expect to happen, late 2027. So that is now expected to enable surpluses to be paid directly to members as lump sum, which I think is really important to make this policy work as well. Employers are, very reluctant to want to add new liabilities to their pension scheme at a cost that isn't defined. Providing lump sums allows you to crystallise a benefit improvement at a fixed cost without the uncertainty of what would happen if instead you were given pension increases. That isn't the case.
Yeah, and I think from a trustee's perspective, thinking about the members as recipients of these lump sums, let's say a member's got a £5,000 pension and you can afford to uplift it by 1%. As a pension increase, what's that, £4 a month? Doesn't feel like a huge benefit when maybe, the overall communication is that the employers had millions of pounds out of the scheme and we've increased your pension by £4 a month. So being able to actually pay the lump sum enables you to give that value a lot quicker. So instead of £4 a month, maybe you're giving them £500, £600, £700 in one go, and it will feel like a much more tangible benefit.
Yes.
In that sense.
Yeah, it would feel more of a win then.
More substantial, yeah.
But I think the point to add here, though, as well, this is currently only drafted to allow it to happen for members over normal pension age, so effectively pensioners. It'd be great if this could happen for members below normal pension age. Employers as well, and probably trustees, they're not just focused at looking at what improvements you can give members. There's a generational point here as well. Employers are concerned about the current workforce. That's where the adequacy problem really is. And some of these members are deferred members. If there's things that you can do to the pension there, that would be, quite powerful. And, I think it's also well known that really surplus sharing, as what the government's trying to do here, is all about, growth in the UK economy, increased productivity, have more invested in the UK. And really it's the non-pensioner group that you really need to focus on to really, change the economics.
And you're left with a real conundrum. If you can award the lump sums to some and not others, then what do you do for those? And, are you setting up little DC accounts? The whole thing becomes a bit of a mess.
Yeah. And just taking a step back a little bit, so the opportunities and risks around surplus sharing are evidently linked to endgame strategies. So what would you say schemes should consider as their first step in deciding their endgame strategy?
Well, so schemes, it's the sponsors and the trustees are going to have to come together in some fashion to collaborate over, what this endgame strategy might be. And that collaboration can take many forms. It can be joint groups, it can be negotiations. We obviously see all different types of collaboration in practice. But often it's very helpful before getting into that, I think, to understand where you're coming from. So your own context, the powers you have, the responsibilities you have, any principles or aims. So I think understanding, where you're coming from, what the art of the possible is, what you can achieve in theory, so that you're going into those sort of debates and those processes with an open mind and an open pair of eyes.
Mm-hmm. And how does that compare to looking at it from a corporate perspective?
So totally agree in terms of you need to be really clear on your own objectives. Mm-hmm. And those objectives need to align, right? I mean, from a sponsor perspective, if there was a desire to, remove off balance sheet for whatever reason, that's part of the corporate strategy.
Mm-hmm.
There's other bigger influences in play here. Run-on is not going to be the answer, but there is innovation in the market in terms of, when those objectives don't align,
mm-hmm.
You can find a possible solution that still fits.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, probably a requirement us as actuaries, on TAS 300 now to explore all the credible alternatives and understand from both parts, from trustees and sponsors' perspective, what would work here,
mm-hmm.
what is it there for the members, what is there for the for the sponsor and the trustees, what are these alternatives and do they fit your objectives? And we also know the insurance market is very clear in terms of they want to be sure that schemes have challenged the alternatives,
mm-hmm.
and they're not just coming here and deploying resources in a quote that might end up pivoting into a different direction.
mm-hmm.
Are you clear that is what your strategy
mm-hmm.
is going to be? And I think there's innovation, right? Innovation is going to drive a lot of these things. As I said, if you're wanting off balance sheet, and trustees want on balance sheet, we saw the Aberdeen Stagecoach deal. Mm-hmm. If the company is very clear on wanting to extract profits and not move to an insurance regime, but the trustees are very keen on wanting to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's other solutions like captives or potentially value share opportunities with insurers as well. So
mm-hmm.
Run-on is one answer. Buyout is an alternative, but there's other things on the table. And let's not forget super funds.
Mm-hmm.
That is going to be I think a developing, growing market, and certainly one to keep a lot of interest in because it's going to open up, the opportunity for potentially more schemes if changes in the gateway test happen, as we're seeing through the current pensions bill.
Mm-hmm.
There should be more schemes that could potentially use super funds, and even those potentially above buyout.
Mm-hmm.
If you use surplus sharing and you end up below buyout, some of these solutions might be combined to get to the eventual outcome.
Yeah. I think it's a really exciting time, actually, an exciting time in pensions. You don't hear that very often.
There is a lot to consider.
There is a lot happening. And I think, as you say, combining a few things can really kind of bring out some quite good solutions. You spoke around fully understanding what run-on can actually mean in terms of surplus release. So how do you actually go about doing that?
So I think first context is really important, right? So size and covenant are really important when it comes to run-on and surplus sharing. So if the scheme is too small, net of expenses and running that scheme, the economics aren't going to work. So it's quite easy to dismiss that as a potential solution. And the same with the covenant is very weak. The thresholds on which surplus release are going to be set by trustees are going to be quite high. There might be additional protections that come into play. And again, the finances and the economics don't work in that situation. And also the balance of powers in the rules. So, what potentially can happen and wind up, who owns the surplus, might influence what you do in a run-on situation as well. And of course, running on isn't necessarily running on and necessarily extracting surplus on an ongoing basis. You can run on and just have a bigger surplus on wind up as well. So it is relevant in that discussion as well. But what do you go about doing? I think do the maths and do the homework, understand what's the projections on the surplus with and without a surplus sharing policy, understand what the downside risks are. There's always risks inherent in a pension scheme, but what's the incremental additional risk if you have a surplus sharing policy, and what are the protections that you can put in place? Employers do not want to be in the place to pay deficit contributions again. And so how you set that mechanism can really influence those risks, what bar you set the release thresholds for surplus, how you're potentially sharing it and what benefits you're improving, and also what contingencies are in place around it. So that all needs to be analysed. And I think there's also ways to potentially reduce some of those risks. How you do the investment strategy, how the funding and investment integrate is also really important in managing that risk, and things like longevity hedging as well.
This isn't going to be right for everybody. There are still going to be those schemes that properly should be looking to secure things and lock them down and head down the buyout route rather than necessarily sharing surplus. And I also think that, like you said earlier, context is key. That context really varies from scheme to scheme. We all think the scheme we're working with is unique, and they are. They've all got their own unique constitutions, trust deeds and rules, their own unique histories. They've reached agreement on, funding and other matters, forever. So I think, as you sort of approach some of this stuff, we also need to be kind of alive to understanding that context properly. I think legal advice is going to be very key. So understanding the powers that you actually have, the responsibilities you have, and like you said earlier, the government has brought this legislation to the table that looks very powerful and may overcome a lot of restrictions in schemes. And so lawyers will be advising on the can you change things and the should you. And I think if the can you is a yes, which it may well be in many cases, I think the should you for some schemes is going to be very hard. For others, maybe it's easier, but I think that whole package of circumstances is going to come into the mix.
Yeah. There are also, unfortunately, as it stands, there are still accounting barriers. That's for some schemes, some employers, that is a really big thing. The accounting point, is very relevant, something to consider early, but unfortunately, there's no magic solutions to it. A lot of that is about just informing the market around what you're doing, understanding what the pension scheme is delivering through surplus sharing if you were going to go down that road and have P&L impacts, and also potentially consider your management metrics. So, does pensions need to be involved in some of the, P&L measures that you have? Is that really demonstrating the right economics of your business? So there are things you can do to educate, I think, to manage that.
Yeah. And of course, surplus sharing isn't new. It can be done under the current legislation. So what are the sorts of surplus sharing deals that we're seeing currently?
So, in terms of actually refunding surplus to sponsors, that doesn't happen very much. I think it has happened. It's been pretty rare. And I think even now where schemes are solvent, and they've got the potential ability to do it under the current legislation, as Bina noted earlier, there's that in the members' interests piece that's been the barrier that some have been able to overcome, but not all that have thought about it would have been able to. So one of the main kind of most vanilla areas has been things like the treatment of expenses. Maybe historically the employer is paid towards the operational costs of the scheme. The surplus provides an opportunity for that to change, and so you're delivering some value to the sponsor economically by changing how those sort of costs are met. And similarly with things like DB and DC accrual, to the extent that that's still happening in the same trust, we've certainly seen that kind of come through in, say, valuation discussions where there's been a surplus and you're looking to, the opportunities to use that surplus. Some of those sort of accrual cost type things I think have been up there.
And we're also seeing, again, more innovation in this space. So employers are bringing DC schemes back into trust to help, share the surplus from DB into DC. And obviously there's an open willingness now for employers to share some of that surplus with members, but the regulations are a game changer in that space. You can see why this is a win-win opportunity. Members would, never really get benefit augmentations in most circumstances. We've seen discretions on pre-97 increases, but beyond that, it's been quite limited generally. We are now seeing with surplus sharing through DC contributions effectively, increases to pensions, increases to, discretionary increases on an ongoing basis, funding discretions to remove pension increase caps. And that's, quite an attractive thing to be doing to keep the real value of pensions. And some of these, sharing policies are being developed so that you don't have to use the surplus each year. The trustees can build up that surplus and use it when it's meaningful in a particular way. So, you could use it on pension increases, or you could build it up to remove caps over time. So yeah, real changes in that. We've also seen some other, more nuanced uses of surplus, for example, paying for guidance for members, which is, an attractive thing for both parties, and also moving unfunded arrangements back into the trust.
Yeah. Yeah, so lots of different ways of using it. But when you've actually been speaking to our clients, what sort of appetite is there for surplus sharing deals?
I'd say huge, right? But it's slow. We're waiting for those regulations to come in place. Unfortunately, some of it might be a little bit late. Some employers already have moved DC trusts away into master trusts and otherwise, and the ability to share surplus there is not easy. Yes, there are tax changes now in surplus sharing such that arguably it's neutral if you refund when you can refund it, put it back into DC contributions, it should be tax neutral, but that's only going to happen when the new regs come in place in 2027. So I think there's pause at the moment, but there is definite interest. So we did a recent survey, and the summary of that was about 50% of schemes of those surveyed were interested in running on, and about 30% of the schemes were deliberately doing that for surplus purposes. Yes, those numbers actually change on scheme size, so it was much lower when it was less than 250 million. But when you look at over $1 billion, those equivalent stats were 2/3 were looking to run on, and 50% were deliberately doing that for surplus sharing and surplus use policies.
And I think that was always the hypothesis, was if the incentives change and the behaviour changes. And for a long time, there's just been, again, not universally, but for a lot of schemes, no upside. And so it's just been this drive towards, de-risk.
Yeah.
And that's it, because, what's the benefit of running the risk? Whereas now, with the surplus acting as a bit of a buffer, a bit more thinking about it, and some upside incentives, it does look like there's some latent demand for behaviour change.
Yeah.
But I guess time will be the tell.
So speaking of times, I'm going to ask you both to do a little bit of future gazing and think 5 years from now, if you were looking back, what would surplus sharing done right look like from a trustee perspective and from a corporate perspective?
Gosh.
Let's start with you, Adam.
Well, I'm sort of thinking, like, what would it look like if it was bad? Because the opposite of that should be what we want. I think if, we saw, a lot of value leak out of schemes that maybe, none of it was shared with members, it goes to sponsors, maybe not even UK sponsors, it gets dividended abroad. And then we see benefit security issues start to come back to the fore after having, just seen such an improvement in the landscape. That would be a terrible outcome from all of this. And we would have really failed to, grasp the opportunity that was really there, which I think there are a lot of positive opportunities. So the good version, what would good look like? Well, I think if you take all those schemes that we've got today, seeing that they're in, rude health in the future, so they might be secured and bought out with an insurer, and that's absolutely fine. Or they're still well funded against something like a low dependency measure, so they're not reliant on the covenant. Yes, the surplus might have been used, but let's see some of it having actually been shared with members. And the government was very clear that the policy, is only really a success, and it's sort of vital to its success that value is shared with members. So I think good is, robust risk management, value shared with members, rude health.
Okay. And from a corporate perspective?
You covered everything there. That's clearly good there, Adam. I think actually having these surplus sharing agreements work out in practice is, that's got to be what good looks like, right? We're seeing win-win situations. That's, employers are getting their refunds, members are getting improvements on their benefits, the protections are working at the thresholds that we're doing it, and employers don't need to put in more money into pension schemes because the run-on is in a very risk-managed way, and run-on is low risk, right? We shouldn't forget it is a low-risk solution. So that would be what good, to me, would look like. But I would also say, it would also be I don't think 5 years is enough for this, but, the whole point of surplus steering policy was actually, to keep pension schemes invested. In the UK, we see more growth. Pension adequacy is improved. I don't think we're going to see that all in 5 years, with regulations only coming in at the end of 2027. But starting to see that would be good. But I would also say, and I think right for sponsors, good should also look like that there are innovative solutions, and there are other solutions that are still being used in the fullest. I'd like to see a more thriving super fund market. I think that is a good opportunity for a number of schemes, and it would become a more bigger opportunity with potentially some of the changes we're seeing, and sponsors could evaluate whether that's the right thing for them. But also, we should be still seeing things move to the insurance market. To me, good is all of these options are considered widely, and there's enough of the market considering all of these.
Choice.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. That's been a very insightful discussion. Now, speaking of choices, one last thing before I let you go. This is something that we roll out to all of our guests.
I've seen
and now I'm nervous.
It's probably the easiest question that you've had so far. So, Adam, could you pick a card, please, and read it out to Bina?
Oh, I think this is the worst of the two. Okay. Oh, would you rather have fingers for toes or have toes for fingers?
Oh, God, that's a complex question. I think fingers for toes. Why is that? Because, fingers are very powerful. You can do so many things with them, right? Far more useful than toes in my mind. So if you had 20 of those versus 10, I'll go with that.
Up on the deal.
And Bina, can you do the same for Adam?
This is mildly terrifying.
Right. Would you, Adam, rather wear wet socks every day or be allowed to wash your hair only once per year?
I'm not wearing wet socks every day. That is never happening. So, and the hair, it's going, right? I'll just get rid of it. That's fine. I can cope with that. So.
I think also if you leave it long enough, it just starts to wash itself.
It's the virtuous cycle.
So I hear,
Just get through that 6-week period and then you'll be okay. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today. And thank you also to our listeners for joining us on the Pensions Perspectives podcast brought to you by WTW. I'm your host, Luna Fadayel, and I look forward to joining you for another conversation that matters. Thanks for listening. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. The views expressed by any hosts and guests are their own and may not reflect those of their employers or affiliated organisations. All content is protected by copyright.